At Donald Trump's inauguration last week, you saw Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, all with front row seats. And when TikTok returned to U.S. users after it was nearly banned, a pop-up message on the app credited Trump with its return. TikTok CEO was also in attendance at the inauguration. So what influence can the growing connection between the new U.S. administration and these tech media executives have on Canadians? Brian McQuinn is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Regina. He's also co-director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence, Data and Conflict. And he joins me now in studio. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing very well. So, Brian, what was your reaction when you saw all those tech executives sitting front and center at the inauguration?
I think many of us expected it, but often now I think what's changed in the administration is that a lot of things that were behind the scenes are now really obvious. I mean, we always know that large companies want to get access to power, and now it's just sort of nakedly so. But I think it's really important that we look at some of the nuances there, because not all of those executives were there necessarily by choice, in the sense that there is as much a threat as there is for some of them that attraction to that power. And I think for some of them, they need to ensure that their companies are not targeted by the new administration, while people like Elon Musk, I think, are there quite willingly and, in fact, sort of jumping around, giving salutes at different times in their sort of support for the administration.
What did you mention? I mentioned this in the introduction, but what did you make of the fact that TikTok had a very quiet and quiet return, but it was sort of loud on the app with the message that said, thanks to President Trump, we're back?
I think it's always important in these situations to really see how things are operating in the United States. And I think it's quite obvious that if you sort of placate and you sort of defer and in some way sort of bend the knee to Trump, you are going to get that access. And I think that's part of their way of understanding how Trump works, as far as being able to show that in a really fundamental way. But I think it's important that we always take a step back and sort of say, what are the dynamics that are happening here? And for me, it's really important that we look at sort of why do these different foreign companies, in this case TikTok, want to have access to Canadians. And what we've done in some of our research is shown the extent to which, whether it's Russia or China, are able to in fact influence Canadians. And we heard a lot about wanting privacy, and a lot of the explanations for why TikTok was banned don't really seem to hold for most Canadians, and I would agree. But the real story going on is, why is it they want to influence how we think about China, how we think about Ukraine, how we think about basically the world? There's a reason why all our apps are banned in China.
When it comes to the difference between people saying, "Wow, this is a privacy issue," or your data is at risk, versus you should be worried about the algorithm and what it's sending you.
Yeah.
Where do you land on that?
So some of the research that we've done is demonstrated, for example, looking at how Russia influenced Canadians and how they go about doing that and the extent to which they do that. So obviously, they want to ensure that Canadians no longer support Ukraine, because this is a big part of what's going on now, obviously, with the war. They are able to operate and sort of push their messages through one of the most active political communities in all of Canada. And how that works is that the messages that they're sending have basically weaponized the far left and the far right in Canada. And the messages are actually pushed, though, by average Canadians. So of that large network, more than 84% are just average Canadians who are basically sending those messages out without necessarily looking. And so that's their way of being able to influence how Canadians feel about a number of different topics. And I think it's important that it's not that Canadians necessarily are supporting Russia or supporting Putin by sending that message. Is that the research shows is that when people forward things, they actually are not really paying attention. And that it's not that they're actually that supportive, is that we're not using our sort of critical minds of like, well, actually, is this something that really is true, or is this kind of sort of close enough to my ideas of how the world works that I'm going to forward it on? And that's their job, is to get just enough of some of these stories to kind of be close enough to what we think or certain communities think, so that they forward it on to hundreds of thousands of Canadians.
What did you make of Mark Zuckerberg coming out and saying, we're not going to do fact checking in a traditional sense anymore, and we're going to go along the lines of community guidelines, or what X has done in other platforms?
So it's important, and this is this sort of the joke at some level, is that the amount of fact-checking that was actually done was almost non-existent, at least outside of, so basically the vast majority of the money they spend is on fact-checking just in the United States. So the rest of the world, which is the majority of their users, gets absolutely none. And so we have examples of, in this case it was also Twitter, but examples of the Taliban's leaders on Twitter operating for years, even while they were killing Canadian soldiers and U.S. soldiers, with Canadian advertisers on their page. And then of the over 200,000 sort of ecosystem of accounts supporting the Taliban, 49 were ever moderated in any real way. And so the amount of fact-checking that's going on outside of the United States pretty much doesn't exist. So it's just that the United States is now going to operate a little bit more like the rest of the world does.
You mentioned, average Canadians are pushing content that's being, promoted by foreign interests.
Absolutely.
What role does, sort of our rage bait and our, now the blue check, you can be rewarded for signing up and sending something along. You're smiling here, but what's your reaction to that?
I mean, so the point here, I think, is always, these are companies that make money by your attention. And I think what we've seen, and whatever your feelings about Trump are, he intuitively understands the attention economy. For whatever, and the idea that whether it's good attention, bad attention, as long as the attention's on me, somehow I'm winning. And that is, to some extent, how social media is structured. That's the sort of code that he's ultimately cracked. And that as long as, whether people are getting angry, whether they're supportive, as long as that attention, as long as you're clicking in the eyeballs, and you now think of the concentration of wealth being quite, the 1% in what they own. But if you look at the concentration of the attention economy, it's 3 or 4 people that control this attention economy for the vast majority of the world. And so there's a reason why they were at the inauguration, because Trump wants them close. He understands intuitively that either through threats or through, carrots or sticks, if they are there, I control the new methods for how I reach people and therefore what they think about the world.
The term broligarchy just kind of rolls off the tongue, and I think I've used it a couple times this morning. And when we extend this to, let's say, Google or YouTube, or even podcasts people are watching and listening to, and Trump's been said to have a lot of success with younger men because of the podcasts that are on, and
Exactly.
Those operate on the same algorithm. So their clips are being taken on TikTok, on Instagram, on X, on Facebook, and being shared. And that's a whole nother ecosystem that happens here. What's the impact of that?
And so this is the piece that I think, again, whatever you're feeling of politics around Trump, he understood that as long as you are able to get attention, as long as you are out there, that is the goal. At every channel, in every way, while a lot of the sort of Democrats were, we should only be seen when we're saying good things, and that they actually avoided a lot of those channels. And it turns out that, for better or for worse, with social media, it is now about attention, and as much as it can be drawn upon you. And so this is why he was as successful as he was, because on, whether it be Joe Rogan or others, he went on and chose to go on all of those different podcasts. And so he was able to, through every avenue available to him, pound out his messages to the world.
There was a report yesterday that said the front row of the press gallery in the White House press room is going to be reserved for influencers,
Exactly.
podcasters, TikTokers, which is it's such a change.
And obviously we're having this conversation here in this on a radio station that's quite different than that. But this is a fundamental change, and I think we've known this change has been going on for a decade. But I think the election of Trump really is going to be one of those turning points where you really see that old legacy media and new media, that there is a fundamental change in the way society gets its information. The vast majority of Canadians now get their information through social media, and if there's no longer fact-checking, if there's no longer any way of them, you have fact-checkers here. Online, there isn't. And so I think that's the real challenge, and it puts more responsibility on the average Canadian to really do that fact-checking themselves. And this is where the research shows it's actually the lack of attention to forwarding things that actually makes the difference. It's not, if someone were to really look at it, they'd be like, actually, this doesn't make any sense. But it's the forwarding and the amplification of that and the lack of attention that really does have the impact that we're seeing.
So what is your advice ultimately to folks? I know it's hard, and it's hard to resist that forward, that share, and we've all done it without fact checking. What is your advice?
So it always sounds very condescending, I think, to say use your critical thought. I think the challenge that we should all do, and it's something that I do on a regular basis, is to be challenging everything that you get, even the stuff that you like. Because when we get stories that kind of, confirmation bias that we really like, we don't really look at it very closely. And so it's often to challenge yourself to listen to things and read things that are the opposite of your view. And as annoyed as it might make you, as angry as it might make you, it's sometimes important, because what the real challenge here, or the real tragedy, is we get caught into these ecosystems where everything that we think, whether it's far left, far right, or everywhere in between, these ecosystems that simply reinforce what you think about the world, and those ideas are never questioned. And I think it's incumbent upon us to sort of put ourselves in different environments to see what people are saying and why.
Brian, thanks so much for your time and expertise today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.